Welcome back to Cody Builds. On today's episode, we're going to be working on building out a custom Hydroboost system for our Dentside Ford Elsworth here. We're going to be using a ton of different components from all over the place. So I'm going to walk you through each piece and component that I use and the pieces that you would have to fabricate if you were going to do this yourself. So starting off here, I've got a Hydroboost system and a master cylinder off of an early 2000s Super Duty pickup truck, okay? There are multiple different types of Hydroboost systems out there. So what we're building today is going to be applicable to that early 2000, like I think it's like a 99 to 03 F250, F350 Hydroboost system, okay? What we need to do is we need to make some brackets that bolt to this Hydroboost system that then will bolt to our firewall, okay? These are the original brackets for the brake booster. And if you look here, I've got a couple bolts in here already that we're gonna have to pull out, but normally the way this would work is this would bolt up to the firewall, something like that, and then the brake booster would bolt to that, and then the master cylinder would bolt to the brake booster. Well, in this situation, these brackets are not going to work for us, okay? We still need to build something very similar to this, but for one, the holes don't line up, and two, the bigger issue is that our distance from the firewall to where this mounts to our pedal, our brake pedal, is completely different. So in order to determine how long our spacers need to be, the first thing that I did, which I've already done, is I got into the truck here. Let's get down in here. So what I did here is I pulled the brake all the way forward up onto the brake switch. The brake switch is installed. It's all the way forward on the stop. And I measured from the outside of the firewall to the hole in our brake pedal assembly here, where we're gonna run our bolt through to the shaft of the master cylinder. In measuring that, I found that my distance here was 5.5 inches, okay? Then I grabbed my tape measure and I measured from the flat side of this mount to the center point of this shaft, okay? And that came out to be 7 inches. So we have a difference of 1.5 inches, and that's what we need to make up with a bracket. You can see the original bracket here is like 4.5 inches. So that was spacing off the firewall about 4.5 inches. We only need 1.5 inches. The next thing that we needed to determine is where on the firewall this thing's going to be located. This portion of the Hydroboost is not centered in our bolt pattern here, so I measured what the distance was from the top bolt down to center, and then from the bottom bolt up to center, okay? And then the other thing I did was I determined that these two bolts here are centered where our master cylinder is, so I measured the distance between this bolt and this bolt, okay? What that allowed me to do was to sketch out how these bolt holes would have to align. If you look here, I've got 4 circles drawn, and these represent 2 bolts for the bracket onto the firewall and 2 bolts onto our master cylinder, our Hydroboost system here. So the distance between these 2 bolts is 2 inches. From the center of this up to our top hole here is 1 inch and 5/16. And that is centered, our center hole is centered on this lower bolt here. So we need to go up from this 1 and 5/16 of an inch. And then I know between this hole and this hole is 3 inches. So that allowed me to determine an overall length of this bracket. And that dimension is basically what's going to be from the bottom side of one end to the top side of the other, okay? And that number came out somewhere around 4.5. It's slightly more. It was actually 4 and 11/16 is what that came out to. So we know that we need a bracket that is at least 4 and 11/16, and I just rounded that up to 4 3/4 tall. Okay, that was step one. The next step here was to figure out the rest of our dimensions. So we know, like I said, that we want this thing to only be 1.5 inches deep off of the Hydroboost system here. So I started to sketch out what this was going to look like. Now this is obviously not to scale because this represents 1.5 inches, this represents 1.5 inches, and this represents 1.5 inches. But essentially what I have here is the design of this bracket. We're going to make this out of poster board. The spacing for our firewall side here, and then you can see from the center of this up 1 inch and 5/16 and over, and then from this down to here should be 3 inches, and I allotted for a 1/2 inch on either side. So these are spaced out at 2 inches, these are spaced out at 3 inches. So I've got 3-inch tab here, a 4-inch tab here, and then these are going to be folded on a 90 in the same direction, and we need to make 2 of these brackets, 1 for each side. They'll be folded in opposite directions. All right, I got my 2 brackets cut out here, and I center punched them to drill out, and I was about to drill them out, and I almost made a huge mistake. Well, it wouldn't have been that huge, but almost made a mistake. So I lined my holes here in these brackets, and what I did not account for, because I'm thinking about these things are going to be just basically a C shape, right? And that works just fine if the spacing across the top mounting points is the same on both the Hydroboost system and the firewall. Grab my tape measure, and you can see center to center is about 3 3/4 on the Hydroboost system. On the firewall, it's closer to 3 1/4. So we have a 1/2 inch difference between the top and the bottom. Had I just cut these out, what would have happened is when we try to mount these, basically they would want to try and splay out because the Hydroboost side are out wider. So what I need to do is actually re-center punch where I want my holes, and I need to move my Hydroboost holes about an 1/8 inch towards the outside, and the firewall holes about an 1/8 inch towards the inside. And that should account for the 1/4 inch difference on each bracket. We're getting an 1/8 and an 1/8 off of each side, so that gives us a 1/4 inch of movement. We get a 1/4 inch of movement out of the other one, that gives us a 1/2. So I'm gonna shift my holes here. I'm gonna measure and re-center punch these. I'll do the same on both these brackets, and then we'll drill these out and get them bent up. All right, I just about made another mistake, but I didn't, because I've been checking things as I go along here, which is a good thing. I measured off of one side when I made all my measurements here. I did not measure both sides because I assumed this was a square pattern. It is not a square pattern. So if you look here, these are, I don't know, maybe 1/4 inch wider, 1/2 inch wider than these. I'm gonna actually measure them up. But what I did was I came over here and I wanted to make sure that I drilled out the right hole size. And that looks great. It fits nicely, right? Well, I actually tried it on this side first, and you can see it doesn't fit, and the spread on these holes is much smaller than they are on the other side. So thankfully I had not yet drilled this side out. So I'm going to remeasure this. We're going to re-punch this for a 3rd time on one of these holes, and then we'll just have to be very careful because these will be directional on which way we bend these. So I want to be sure that I get these oriented in the proper direction. Also, I need to be sure that I mark the proper hole for this, because if I don't, the offset will be wrong on the bracket to where the center of the Hydroboost comes through the firewall. So I'll take my time here. I'll remeasure these, I'll remark them, and then we will drill this one out and we'll get these bent up for good. But you can see I've got my Hydroboost mounted, I've got my brackets on up there, but we're kind of in like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation. I can't really make my brackets any shorter Based on the ability of my press brake, I can't make those two mounting tabs any closer together. And really, this thing is about, I would say, 1/4 to 1/2 inch too far out of the firewall. So it needs to come back about 1/4 or 1/2 inch. The other option is that we could actually re-drill the location, the mounting location on the pedal, which I've marked and is feasible. There's plenty of meat in the pedal where it's going to be mounted. It is possible that we can just re-drill it and we can get the arm aligned much better. What I need to do now is I actually need to remove the Hydroboost and the brake master cylinder. I need to remove the brackets. But in addition to that, I also need to remove the pedal box. So I said 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Now that's okay because I've also measured out my clutch pedal and figured out that my stop needs to be about 1 inch longer. And the nice part about that is both my pedal and my clutch are gonna end up being pretty much level with one another up against the stops like that. And that should resolve the brake issue as well, because the issue is I'm not getting full stroke of the brake pedal at the moment. So we're short by, like I said, about 1/4, 1/2 inch. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna pull all this off. I'm gonna re-drill the arm on the brake pedal, and we're gonna fix the clutch pedal shaft. Then we'll put the pedal box back in. While the brackets are out, we're gonna get all of that painted. We're gonna paint the Hydroboost portion tonight. And then tomorrow, we are going to mount this proportioning valve. This is a bare proportioning valve. I like the way these mount up underneath these can mount up underneath the brake master cylinder. They've got this nice little curved portion here. These are designed to work specifically with a bare master cylinder, but there's no reason I can't make a bracket that mounts here and on the other boss and allows this to sit underneath the master cylinder and mount up tight underneath there. So we're going to make ourselves a bracket that's going to encompass our 2 bosses and be able to bolt in this proportioning valve in there like that, and then we'll have an adjustable proportioning valve that's tucked up nice and tight underneath the master cylinder here, and just in general looks nice and clean. Check it out here, guys. I got my bracket in, I've got my proportioning valve in. This turned out pretty darn slick. This is gonna be really nice, kind of tucked up under the master cylinder, hidden away. I'll easily be able to connect my lines over here from the master cylinder over to the proportioning valve, and then from there down to my inputs on the frame. So yeah, I like this a lot. It's basically ready to be taken apart. I gotta paint this bracket, I'm gonna paint it black. I've cleaned up the master cylinder really well here. I've cleaned up the Hydroboost system. Over here, I did go ahead and get my brackets all painted up. So as soon as these are dry to the touch, we are gonna install the brackets, reinstall the pedal box. You can see I re-drilled the hole in this. It was like right here. So we're talking about moving that like 1/4 of an inch. So not a huge move, but it's gonna make a big difference on the pedal. I moved it up just a little bit higher to make our push rod in the Hydroboost system more perpendicular to the firewall so that it is pushing straight into the Hydroboost rather than at a severe angle. So we're really just about ready to start assembling all of this. And then once we get all of this attached and assembled, we've got to make all the various lines for the power steering and for the Hydroboost system here. And to make all those power steering fittings, we're going to be using some DIY All-Star Performance power steering fittings, as well as power steering hose. So I'll walk you guys through how to assemble those hoses, how to cut them to length, make them custom, and then we will assemble this whole system, and we should be then done with the power steering up to the rack as well as the brake system. So where we left off yesterday, I got the Hydroboost and the master cylinder mounted up to the firewall. You can see we've got our new brackets back there. Everything's bolted down tight. It's in its permanent location. You can also see down under here the adjustable proportioning valve from Bear. This all turned out so nice, guys. I'm really thrilled with how this turned out. I'm pretty proud that that turned out so clean and looks so nice in there. On the inside of the truck, I did throw the column in here loosely because I wanted to take a look at the steering and what we're going to have to do for that. But you can see down here the pedals. I've got full pedal travel, which is great on the brake pedal. Same thing on the clutch now. So we've got full pedal travel on both the clutch and the brake. We're making really good progress here. That said, what we're left with is installing all of the power steering lines as well as the brake lines off the master cylinder to our proportioning valve. So I'm going to take you guys over here to my table and show you what we're going to be working with. This is all the different fittings that we're going to be using to make this Hydroboost system connect up to our power steering pump and then down to the rack. So what I've got here is power steering hose from All-Star Performance. You can see this is heavy duty, thick power steering hose. This is for our high pressure lines. These are the high pressure fittings from All-Star Performance that correspond with this hose. You can buy something very similar from Earl's. The difference is the Earl's components, these were 3 to 4 times more expensive a piece, and the hose I think was 3 times more expensive. I might have been 2 times more expensive than the All-Star hose was. So I was willing to go out on a limb and try this All-Star Performance fittings and hoses out. I've used All-Star Performance for some other things, dating all the way back to when I used to do demolition derby, and I always had pretty good luck with them. So all the fittings that we're going to use on the high pressure side are steel. You do not want to use aluminum AN fittings or AN, just regular old AN hose for any of the high pressure fittings, okay? You want to be sure that you're using high pressure power steering hose that's rated for whatever pressure you're going to be running through your line. So I believe the burst strength on this hose is somewhere around 3,000 psi, and our pump's going to be putting out about 12 to 1,500 psi, I believe. So compare that to AN hose, which usually has a burst strength of less than 1,000 psi. It's usually around 300-400 psi. So you do not want to use the AN hose for your high pressure side. Now on the return side, we can use the AN line, and that's what we're going to use here. We've got some AN rubber line here, and we've got all of our AN fittings for the low pressure side. So just to recap, regular AN aluminum fittings, low pressure side, steel fittings, high pressure power steering hose on the supply side. The last piece that's going to make this whole puzzle kind of work here is this Heights Performance adjustable pressure valve for the power steering lines. So the way this Hydroboost system is going to work is we're going to run a high pressure line from our power steering pump up to the Hydroboost system, out of the Hydroboost system to this Heights valve, okay? And that should be somewhere around 12 to 1,500 psi of input pressure. We're then going to adjust this down to about 800 psi for the Mustang 2 rack. So the Mustang 2 rack requires significantly less pressure than the standard steering box. So if we were to run that 12 to 1,500 psi of pressure from the Hydroboost down to the rack, odds are we're going to blow the seals out of the rack. So if you are operating a Hydroboost system or you've switched over to a Mustang 2 style rack and you're continually blowing out seals, one thing you might want to look at is whatever the pressure is that you're getting off of your power steering pump. So if you're getting in excess of 800, 850 psi, odds are you're probably blowing the seals out of your rack. Now there are a number of kits that you can buy that will provide you with all the fittings and everything you need to make this Hydroboost conversion. One that I can think of is Battleborn. They have a nice kit out there. It's $850 for everything you need to convert from regular vacuum assisted brakes to a Hydroboost system. I did not go with that setup because, one, I thought I could source all the parts for cheaper, and two, I wanted to make it more custom to the look that I want for my truck. So using this black braided nylon line versus like the stainless line that comes with that Battleborn system. So there's just a number of things. I think they do offer like a black rubberized coating for some of it, but I just wanted the fittings. I wanted to upgrade in the fittings department. I wanted to upgrade just across the board a number of things. So what I quickly learned was if you're going to do that and you are going to upgrade your fittings and all your different things, the cost goes way up very rapidly. So all the cost of all these fittings is sky high. It's kind of ridiculous. Some of these, if you were to buy like an Earl's 45-degree power steering fitting, it's like 35 or 40 bucks. These, I think they're around 15 to 20 bucks depending on the fitting. So significantly cheaper than the Earl's stuff, but the cost of something looking nice and upgrading in all the fittings does increase the cost significantly. I think I'm still just under the Battleborn kit, but it's probably closer than what I would have originally wanted. So as part of that, one of the things that I purchased is this banjo bolt kit for the Hydroboost system. So instead of using the standard fittings and having those come up and out of the box, we're going to use these banjo style fittings, which will really clean up the look. I'm going to link all of the part numbers and where I bought the parts from in the description, so you guys will be able to buy anything you see here for your setup, assuming you buy the same Hydroboost pump and you're using a Saginaw power steering pump and a Mustang 2 rack like I am. So before we install these banjo style fittings, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to put an extremely light coat of grease on these O-rings, and that's just going to help them slide a little bit on the metal and not tear the O-rings. And when I say a minimal amount, we're not gooping this grease on here. We're just very lightly greasing these. It's a very nice light coat. And I'm going to do this on any O-ring in the system. So you'll see later on we've got some O-rings here for different fittings. On that one's for the rack. Those are the adapters for the rack. So throughout this build, wherever there's an O-ring, we are going to be greasing it up before we do the first installation. So I've got all three of these banjo fittings in. I'm not going to tighten them down just yet because I want to organize the hoses before we tighten those down. Know kind of what angle we're going to put the hoses at before we get any of that installed. So the next step here, I'm going to put my two fittings down on the rack to convert them from the metric style fitting they are to an AN style adapter. Okay, so down on the rack down here, there's two different fittings. One for the supply and one for the return out of the rack. On this particular rack is a Mustang 2 style rack. My supply is going to be the closest to the rack here, and the return is going to be the closest to the steering shaft up here. So you want to make sure you get this right for your steering rack. I know on this Mustang 2 style one, if you get these inverted, you will blow out the seals in this rack. All right, so now that I've got the steering rack fittings in, and I've got the fitting put into the back side and I've got my adapter fitting put in the back side of my power steering box. The next thing I did here was I went ahead and I attached all my hose ends to everything and started kind of laying out how these hoses are going to lie. So you can see here we've got a 6AN high pressure fitting here. You can see on our valve here we've got all of our tube fittings laid out how we want them. Same back here. So I've got these routed kind of nicely. You can see we've got our banjo fittings and then all of our AN fittings installed. The two for the pressure and the one for the return, the one regular AN for the return. You'll notice all my AN fittings that are just like standard AN hose are all black, and everything else in the high pressure is just this metallic silver. It wasn't really My original intent to do that, I wanted to get all black fittings, but finding the high pressure fittings that weren't ridiculously expensive in black was pretty much impossible. You can get them through Earl's, I think, but they were very expensive. But the nice part about this is it will distinguish by eye what's your low pressure versus your high pressure. If there's ever a question, we know that black is always going to be low pressure and the silver here is going to be high pressure. So off of our fittings here, you can see I've got these three routed nicely together where they're all going to come together and run down the firewall here. I'm sorry, the inner fender here. This is our input pressure here. So this is going to come from our steering box. So this is going to come from our power steering box. So that hose is going to run, basically we've got a 90 here. It's going to turn up, turn along the fender and come up here. This is our output that's going to run through our valve here. So that's going to come straight to this valve. And then we're going to come off of the valve down to the steering box. On the return side, we're going to run a line down to the steering box, and I've got a T down at the steering box. We'll connect into the T down there, come off of the T back up to the return side of the valve here, and then out of the return back into the box. So that's how we're going to route everything. Now that I've got all of the lines kind of laid out how I want them, I'm going to go ahead and drill out this valve because I like this. I like the way everything's laying out. I'm going to drill out our other hole here and get this mounted up permanently so it's not moving around on me. And then we're going to start measuring and cutting for our high pressure power steering hoses and then the regular AN hoses. All right, so I went ahead and got my second bolt put into my valve here, and I created my first hose. So you guys get an idea what this is gonna look like here. This is the easiest one to make, but now I'm gonna walk you through how to make these hoses. They're not very difficult at all. It's very straightforward. There's just a few little things you need to watch out for. So we're gonna make the hose that runs from our power steering pump all the way up to our booster system here. This is gonna be the longest hose we have to make. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys how to do that now. All right, so the first fitting we're going to put on is 90-degree fitting, and these are two-piece fittings, okay? So if you unscrew this fitting, I'll show you exactly what this looks like. You've got this fitting with this kind of tapered end on it. This is going to go down inside the hose, and then this is going to go over the outside of the sheathing of the hose. If you look inside, there's some really coarse threads here that are reverse threaded. So turn this to the left, it's going to tighten down on the sheathing of the hose. So on the hose end, what you want to make sure is you've got a nice flush cut. Okay, and if you got a nice flush cut, you can go ahead, slide your end over, your first fitting over here, the one that slides over the sheathing, and we're going to turn this counterclockwise, okay? And the one thing you want to watch out for this, you're going to run this all the way down. And the one thing you want to watch out for when you look down inside of this fitting, it's going to be a little hard to see on the camera, but you want to see the rubber hose flush up against the end of this fitting all the way around. So I've got this as tight as I can get it by hand, and then I'm just going to take it a quarter of a turn back, okay? Just a quarter of a turn, no more. So by turning that back by a quarter of a turn, what that does is as this is setting in, basically you can see this is tapered, right? And this is going to drive down inside the tube, and it's going to spread the tube out and push the tube out tight against this fitting, okay? If you go all the way down tight, the last couple threads of this are going to be extremely tough, and you may even spin the hose in our fitting here, and that's not what you want. So just a quarter of a turn back, no more. That should give you enough room to run this all the way down to bottom out the threads in this fitting, okay? So I'm just going to take a little bit of assembly lube here, and they make a special lube for this, but I'm just using regular old assembly lube, and I'm just using a very small amount. I'm wiping off the excess here, and then I'm going to put my hose end into my vise here. Okay, I'm going to tighten that down, and then I'm going to put this fitting in, and I'm going to start to turn this in. You can feel that grab, and then we're going to grab our wrench, and we're just going to tighten this all the way down, all the way till we bottom this fitting out. And you want to make sure as you're getting towards the bottom here that your hose is not turning. If your hose is turning, something's wrong. You want to stop what you're doing, back the fitting out. And you will get quite a bit of resistance once you get towards the last few threads. All right, that's it, guys. That's one hose end done. We're going to hook this up on the truck and we're going to measure out the length that we want. We're going to cut this hose to length and then reinstall the other end. All right, so you guys can see I've got this routed down along this hose. I want it to run tight up against that hose. We've got it turning to 90 and it's going to come into this fitting at the back of the box here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure. We're basically measuring right to the end of the hex here on this fitting. All right, so I'm going to measure to that. I'm going to put a little dot there with my paint pen, and that's how I'm going to know where to cut on my hose. Kind of like that right there. So I think that's going to be about right there. Okay, I'm just going to gently squeeze my hose in the vise there. And there's a couple ways you can cut this. You can use a hacksaw, you could use a bandsaw. I'm going to use just a regular old cutoff wheel on the grinder here. So I'm going to hold my hose out straight so we get a nice perpendicular cut to the hose. Now, after you make the cut, you want to clean the hose out. So I'm going to blow this out with some air. And then I'm going to take a little piece of paper towel and I'm just going to run it up there, or a Q-tip or something like that. Something that's non-shedding. And run that up inside the end of the hose here to get all the little bits of rubber out. And I'm going to twist as I pull it out. Look at all that rubber that's left behind. Okay, so I'm going to do that a couple times to make sure we're clean. Once nothing else is coming out of this hose, then we're going to install the next fitting. All right, same process here. Going to put our fitting on the end. Turn it counterclockwise. Inspect the inside again, and then back it off just a quarter of a turn. Okay, I'm going to take my fitting again. A little assembly lube on the thread and the tip there. Spread that around. Wipe off the excess. And our fitting goes in the vise. Our tip goes in. And then tighten this thing down until it's bottomed out. Now I've got two 90s on this one, so we are going to have to clock one of these ends. You can clock these by turning this fitting after you bottom it all the way out, but you want to back this fitting out no more than one full rotation. And you think about it, when you clock it, you shouldn't have to turn it more than a full rotation. You should only have to turn it the amount that you need, and if you're going a full rotation, well, then you've already gone past where you need it clocked. So I'm going to tighten this down, and then we're going to see about clocking these. Run that down. Okay, and I can see we need to clock this thing 180 degrees from where it currently is. So I'm going to pull this off and I'm going to rotate my fitting back a half a turn. All right, there you can see we've got our two hoses run. One to the valve, one to the back of the power steering box. And then the last high pressure line we need to make is this one from the valve down to the power steering rack. So I'm going to go ahead and make up this line, then we'll jump over to the return side. So I've got most of my return lines run. The only one I have left is this last one. I didn't show how those connect because they actually assemble in the exact same manner as our power steering lines do. You screw on the first fitting to the hose around the sheathing, and then you screw in the actual AN fitting into that end assembly. So it's really straightforward. Same process for the return lines. The one thing I will mention that I haven't said yet, I don't think, is me personally, I always buy the same brand of hose as the end fittings. So these are Summit fittings for the return line. I bought Summit return hose as well. For the power steering lines, I did the All-Star Performance power steering hose and the All-Star Performance fittings. I don't like to mix and match. I think small discrepancies in the hoses and the fittings can result in leaking. That's what I found. That doesn't mean you can't do it. I just don't personally recommend it unless it's like a last-ditch effort. It's what you got in the shop and you got to make it work. You can see how nicely they all routed together. I'll end up cleaning these up with zip ties. You know, I'll get in here and I'll zip tie these all together, make them, bundle them up really nice. I'll need to bundle up and zip tie the bottoms down here. Now I don't have anything tightened down just yet. I've kept everything loose for adjustment purposes, but I really like where this is going. Everything Hose lengths all look really good. It's a super clean install, I think, for a Hydroboost system. The Hydroboost setups are really hard to make look clean, I think, just because there's so many extra hoses and fittings and all that. But by going with the AN style, it cleans up everything. You can really do this on the cheap, and you can just use regular old hose and hose clamps on the return line if you want. I just wanted something that was a little bit nicer, that was going to kind of match all the rest of the sheathing that I have on the wiring and the fuel line hoses and all that stuff, just to keep it all like one kind of consistent look here under the hood. So I'm super happy with it. It's a little more expensive to do it this way, but I really like the way this is turning out. So I'm gonna go ahead now and make up my last return line. I started to bend up some mock-up lines here for some brake lines from the master cylinder down to the proportioning valve. I'm using TIG rod. This is like this is 1/8. I believe this is a 1/8 TIG rod, and I'm using 3/16 tubing, which actually works out pretty well because I can actually slide this 1/8 TIG rod into the orifices of the master cylinder and the proportioning valve down there. So it gives you a really good mock-up of what the brake lines are going to look like. A template basically for me to now use to bend up some brake lines. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to bend up these 2 brake lines and get these mounted, and then the last thing we need to do is figure out what fittings we need to go from our proportioning valve down to our bulkhead fittings on the frame. The only challenge there is, since I did all this without the steering column in, those brake fittings fall directly under the steering column. So we're gonna have to think about how we're gonna kick the lines out and up and around. I was planning on using soft lines, so we'll see. Once we get everything kind of put together here, I might even throw the steering shaft in just to give myself an idea of where that's going to land. I am going to have to order an additional U-joint to clear my headers down here. It's not by much that it missed, but it's not by much that it hits, but it's enough that I don't think I can clearance it on the headers, and I'd rather just throw in an extra U-joint down on the shaft down there. So that'll all have to wait for another video, but for now I think we're going to finish this video out by making up these hard lines and mounting them to the master cylinder and the brake proportioning valve. So I think that's what we're going to call this episode, guys. That's a lot of really good progress on Elsworth this week. It's a huge weight off my shoulders to have the Hydroboost system mounted up to the firewall, have the pedal sorted out, the clutch and the brake pedal. I've got to order a few more parts for the brake system here and for the power steering system, and just a couple fittings that I missed on the size on. So we're going to go ahead and get those ordered. And when we put those in, we're going to be putting in the steering column, the last few fittings for the brake system, the power steering system, and we should be able to tidy up that entire system and be completely done with the brake system and the power steering system and the steering system in general, other than an alignment. So we are very, very close to driving this thing. But however, while I'm waiting on parts, I think the next video we're going to start to focus on the interior of the truck. We're going to buff out the entire top side of the cab, the back pillars, clean the door panels up, get all that done, get the carpet in, get the seating, get the headliner in, and have a completed interior the next time you guys see this truck. So that is the plan for next week. We're gonna hammer on that while we get parts ordered for the rest of the system. And then we're just down to the last few odds and ends, nitty gritty details. I got some new fans to replace the cheap ones in the cheap Chinese ones in the radiator here. We've got to fix our leak in our water neck, and then just a few other odds and ends, guys. So I'm very excited here. Hopefully, maybe in the next 3 episodes, we'll be driving this thing. We'll see, 3, maybe 4 episodes. We're coming down to the wire now, and it feels really good to be closing this chapter of this build out. It doesn't mean we're going to be done with this truck. This truck will probably never be done. We're always going to have something to do on it, but it means we can move on to our next big project, which I'm really excited to show you guys here in a few weeks. So that said, guys, you know the deal. If you don't work on your projects, they will not work on themselves. Get out in the garage, get building. I'll see you on the next episode of Cody Builds.